Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining this afternoon. This is a webinar next in the series that is run by the One Basin CRC and in collaboration with Water Research Australia and the AustralianWaterSchool. And the webinar that we are watching today is all around how variability in water affects communities in the Northern Murray-Darling Basin. And it's presenting some research findings from one of the first projects that the CRC has commissioned. So just very quickly, some of you may not be entirely familiar with the One Basin CRC. We're a relatively new organisation starting in mid-2022, and we have the vision of seeing Australia's irrigation regions as being the most productive, resilient and sustainable in the world. We received a significant amount of grant funding through the Commonwealth Government's Cooperative Research Centre program, and that in combination with our 88 or so partners from both industry and the research sectors will give us about a 10-year life and a long time to do some really good research with potential for impact. So we're going to work together to really grow the value from water in a changing world. That's our significant purpose in a very collaborative spirit and over a long time frame. Now, importantly, the CRC, given the Murray-Darling Basin is the focus, we are regionally distributed. We've now established 4 regional hubs, and there's a map on your screen there to show the distribution of the hubs. Northernmost is Gundawindi. Then we have a hub established in Griffith in New South Wales, Mildura in Northern Victoria, and the one closest to where I'm located today is the Loxton hub in the Lower Murray region. Our head office is based in Melbourne, but we also have, through our university partners, presence in a number of universities and cities across southeastern Australia, which you can see there. So we do have a panel together today. There's obviously me, Neville Crossman. I'm relatively new to the CRC, having joined only about 6 weeks ago as the program leader for the Adaptation and Innovation Program, as well as having a role around government engagement and business development. And so I'm obviously welcoming you to the webinar today and chairing the overall meeting. And then we have 2 others on the panel, and I'll hand over to Marty first to introduce herself, and then Vicki I'll hand over to give an introduction, and she can have the floor from there. So Marty.
Thanks, Nev. Hi, everybody. My name is Marty Beeston. I'm the Regional Hub Manager for the One Basin CRC based up in Gundawindi. So I've been working in Murray-Darling Basin water management for the last almost 3 years, and my background is in environmental planning. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vicki. I'm an environmental social scientist, and I will give you a little bit more information shortly about where I work and the type of work we do.
So we did do a little bit of pre-webinar polling for those of you that joined. Hopefully you had a chance to answer some of those questions. We did this because we were quite curious to see, obviously, the distribution of our attendees today. And clearly there's a strong representation amongst the audience from government policy and planning sector, as well as academia and the commercial consulting world as well, which is really nice to see. Then we also wanted to, just out of curiosity, see geographically where the attendees are from. And I'm just sort of getting my head around the results now. Okay, nearly half are from outside the Murray-Darling Basin, but within Australia. 13% from overseas. So welcome to all of you from overseas. Hopefully it's not either too late or too early. But if it is, well, congratulations on attending at that ungamely hour. But also within the basin, it's nice to see roughly nearly a third of the attendees from the Southern Basin, and then about 14% from the Northern Basin, which is really interesting. And then we were quite keen to see also whether attendees are from urban regions or regional. And I see that, 2/3 are from an urban region, and the remaining third are from outside the larger cities in rural and regional areas, I guess, both in Australia and internationally. So, yeah, fascinating figures there. Thanks, Vicki. Back to you.
Thanks. So, yeah, we're really pleased to be sharing this social research on the Northern Murray-Darling Basin. But first, we'd like to recognise and acknowledge the unique relationship and deep connection to country shared by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as First Peoples and traditional owners of Australia. We pay our respects to their cultures, country and elders past and present. I'd particularly like to acknowledge traditional owners from the Murray-Darling Basin, which is obviously the area of focus of this project. And as many of you know, the basin spans the unceded lands of numerous First Nations peoples. And today I'm coming to you from Yagara and Turrbal lands. So I'm a social scientist with Mosaic Insights, and Mosaic is part of the wider Alluvium group of environmental consultancies based primarily here in Australia. We'd like to acknowledge the One Basin CRC for funding for this project as part of the Quick Start program. And today I'll be presenting this work on behalf of the research team. So the bulk of this research was actually conducted by Dr. Natalie Jones and Jess Walker. I believe Jess is on the call today. And Natalie and Jess are two social scientists that work with us at Mosaic Insights. So I'll do my best to represent their work today. But if you have any questions that I'm unable to answer, I'm happy to pass them on to the team for you. Okay, so in this talk, we'll go through what the project's aims were, the method, the findings, and we'll conclude with the research gaps. So our task was to understand the effects on communities of variability in water access and availability, specifically in the communities in the Northern Murray-Darling Basin. So we know that this is an area that's underserved in research attention in the past. Now, for those of you who don't know the Northern Basin, it spans northern New South Wales and Queensland, southern Queensland. It covers roughly half of the basin area. It's subtropical in the north and semi-arid in the west. Agriculture is its primary economic activity, with irrigated farming playing a really significant role in that. Now, the main agricultural activities in the Northern Basin include cotton, cereals, and grazing. The tributaries of the Northern Basin flow into the Darling River, which then joins the Murray River in the Southern Basin. And water for agriculture is extracted from groundwater, the rivers themselves, so either pumped or gravity fed, and via overland flow, which is referred to as floodplain harvesting. Now, this somewhat older image from CSIRO serves the purpose in showing you what the water balance is like across the year and the different seasons. So there's high levels are highlighted in blue and low in orange and red. So I want you to notice the top half of these maps being the Northern Basin region. We can see that water availability varies seasonally with rainfall and river flows mainly occurring in summer. Now, rainfall and runoff in the Northern Basin does vary greatly within the year, but also across years and decades. And the past 2 decades in the Murray-Darling Basin have been relatively dry. But there are other drivers of water variability. So these include the regulating structures, such as dams and storages, river diversions, water transfer pipelines, and floodplain harvesting. And in the early 2000s, we saw the millennium drought occur. So the Northern Basin felt this between the years of 2001 and 2009, and particularly in the autumn months. Now, there's also managed environmental flows, and these are designed to return water to ecosystems. and it's managed by the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder. So although the Northern Basin does experience irregular and sometimes severe flooding, water scarcity and water management really remain those great challenges for the region. So these challenges are expected to persist into the future, as predictions indicate the basin will be hotter, drier, and experience lower mean annual stream flow and more frequent hydrological droughts. So, given all of these challenges, we sought to understand how variability in access and availability of water really affects those Northern Basin communities. We set out to understand what the research to date tells us and identify what the research or gaps in knowledge are, particularly research knowledge. We'll turn to the methods that we used. There were 4 project tasks. First was the literature review. That then helped us to develop a draft conceptual model that explains how differences in water variability lead to different outcomes in communities. We ran the model through a ground truthing workshop with relevant members of communities in the Northern Basin, and then that helped us to finalise the conceptual model and ultimately identify those research gaps. So the literature we were looking at was specifically empirical studies, that is, studies that documented the community's experiences of water variability, rather than any sort of discussion papers or policy documents, that sort of thing. We had to expand the search to the whole of the Murray-Darling Basin, and that was largely because there's very few studies that have focused specifically on community impacts of water variability in the Northern Basin, but it also helped us compare the 2 regions, Northern and Southern. So the studies that we looked at were between the year 2000, so just before that millennium drought began, through to November last year. And we searched the academic databases for scientific journals and articles and relevant websites that had publications that were related to the Murray-Darling Basin. So the next few slides have a lot of words on them. I don't expect you to read them all, but we just wanted to show you the extent of the search terms that we used so that you get an idea of how comprehensive this study was. So the search terms were developed with the Project Advisory Committee, and that was made up of basin experts across academia, government and non-government organisations. So here you can see the list of place names that we used. We used quite a wide range of terms that described variability and the drivers of variability in water, as well as a wide range of terms to describe the social effects, along with many related issues and potential outcomes of those effects. So all up, this generated 23 different search terms, or search strings rather, to run through the various databases. So altogether, we came up with over 2,400 articles, but more than 400 of these were duplicates, so they, of course, were removed. And for anyone who's ever done a systematic review before, it'll come as no surprise that the bulk of the papers were actually had to be excluded because they didn't meet our inclusion criteria. And this was particularly a problem for this study because the term community is used widely in papers from the natural sciences where they're talking about communities of perhaps fish or plants, etc. So that left us with 94 papers or different studies to examine. So for each of these studies, we identified the study location, the water level, the research method, and the particular social effect experienced by the community. Now, the first 3 of these study characteristics have fairly simple categories, so shown in the brackets there. But what was more challenging was to work out how to group the social effects, and this is really key for the development of the conceptual model. So Neville and others in our project advisory committee suggested that we use the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, recent 2022 Values Assessment Framework. So this framework brings together the latest global knowledge and understanding about how to define and measure how humans value, relate to, and derive benefit from nature. So the framework identifies different categories of values, from the overarching worldviews and knowledge systems to broader values that act as guiding principles in our lives, down to specific values that are particular to the context that you're studying. So in this case, it's rivers, river systems and waterways. So the typology uses 4 life frames shown in the spotlights on the right there. These are described as living from, in, with, and as nature. So what these life frames do is they can cut across the values typologies and help us organise sets of values. It also shows us how particular values are emphasised more than others, and especially in decision-making contexts. So we adapted these life frames and developed some plain language labels to help us analyse the studies that we found. So in a nutshell, we use the term water use to refer to using water as a natural resource, particularly for livelihoods. Waterways as social settings refers to the use of waterways as a place for social activities such as recreation or socialising. Stewardship and ecological learning, particularly in this study, includes the learning and caring for ecosystem health. And finally, spiritual and cultural connections refers to the holistic view that humans are a part of nature, we're not separate, and those interconnected relationships that exist between all living things in nature. So let's take a look at the findings. So the analysis confirmed that, yes, in fact, compared to the Southern Basin, the Northern Basin has received relatively little research attention on social effects of water variability. Now, most studies across the whole basin have really focused on effects of low water levels, that includes droughts. And there's also been a mix of quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods used for that research. Now, normally I really dislike word clouds, but I wanted to show you this one just to illustrate the focus of the themes of many of these research studies. So our team summarised the different effects, and we used that summary information to create this word cloud. And what you can see is that strong emphasis on livelihood impacts, particularly for farmers, which is not surprising given the importance of agriculture in the Northern Basin, or across the whole basin, I should say. Okay, now this slide shows you how many studies were identified in each of the water variability categories we used across the different basin regions. So we've got Northern Basin, Southern Basin, and the third one is the entire basin. So you can see that for the Northern Basin, there's only been a few studies. There's 6 on low water effects or drought, and 5 on managed water effects. There were no studies on flooding effects on Northern Basin communities. Then if we look at the number of studies across the different social effects categories, we see that most of the studies have focused on waterway use as a natural resource for humans. And there's been far fewer studies on those deep connections and value that humans hold for ecological ecosystem health in its own right. Yeah. The next thing we did was then map the studies across the different social effects and the water variability categories. And I'll show you what the results look like in a moment. But this helped us develop the draft conceptual model. which we then took to the Northern Basin communities to review our framework. So we asked select members of these communities, and we sent materials to them prior to the workshops so that they had time to consider the project and the findings and help identify those knowledge gaps. So there were some challenges in the workshop, and we want to acknowledge those. We knew it would be best to be done in person, but there were obviously some logistical challenges in bringing people from such a wide area together in one place. And of course, we were constrained by the budget and the time that we had available. So we had to do it online, which is not ideal, but it still helped. So we also acknowledge that this is actually quite an academic exercise. It's not your standard sort of consultation type of workshop. So that was challenging, to say the least. And we also know that the effects that we're talking about can be really acutely felt by community members, and it can be quite an emotional discussion. But there's also been a long history, as many of you know, of political complexity around water management in the basin. And so some of these dynamics came through in the workshop discussion. But nevertheless, we were able to identify a few gaps in the conceptual model, but we want to flag that there's still more work that could be done in this regard. And at this point, we really want to thank the workshop participants for their time and their willingness to share their experiences with us. Right. Now, to show you the findings and the final conceptual framework, which are really quite detailed, I've broken this into 3 slides based on the water variability category. And I'll step you through the findings. So this first slide will show you the social effects of low water levels, so including drought. And you can see the number of Northern Basin studies in each group in the circle at the top of the column. In a moment, you'll see the different results, and there'll be green, red, and blue dots to signify whether these effects were positive, negative, or neutral, or sometimes a combination. So most of these papers related to drought, although some low water papers referred to water reduction from over-extraction and allocation issues, both of which, of course, can reduce the amount of water available for others. So in terms of waterway use, the results show that low water affects people's livelihoods, specifically farmers and their practices, and mostly in negative ways. A water scarcity and drought also impacts water trading and water prices. So this can lead to benefits for landholders who sell their allocations, but conversely, the negative impacts are the higher prices for other landholders. Oh, sorry. Should stay on this one for just a moment longer. So the studies also showed impacts on people's physical and mental well-being, and interestingly, that men and women experience drought differently. There were positive and negative impacts on people's participation in water use decision-making. So some studies showed that people feel left out of these decision-making processes. But on the other hand, some irrigators were more likely to work collectively and make decisions together in times of low water use to meet their water needs. And it's probably no surprise that some studies found negative effects on people's use of water to sustain themselves, so particularly for domestic purposes. In terms of impacts on waterways as social settings, the literature demonstrated that low water and drought can lead to changes in an individual or community's identity in situations where, for example, farmers might have to exit the agricultural industry, or in a more positive direction when they develop social innovations such as new entrepreneurial activities to adapt to change. So these events can result in changes to the social landscapes, sometimes with effects on sustainability and cohesion in communities, including the knock-on effects of job losses, health impacts from reduced medical services, and the migration of young people for education and employment opportunities. The drought and low water also impacts people's use and enjoyment of water as a place for socialising and recreation, including fishing. And one study linked people's appreciation of aesthetic and recreational values of waterways to property prices, with landowners preferring, not surprisingly, neither low or high water levels. For stewardship and ecological learning, these papers focus on the importance people place on their roles and responsibilities in caring for waterways and protecting ecological functions. Now, this group includes waterway environments as places of learning and or sharing knowledge. For example, some studies found that low water or drought leads to educational campaigns and learning experiences for people to observe environmental degradation or learn how to live with water scarcity. Now, a number of studies also linked waterway use with learning and innovation in farming systems. So some farmers had to pay more attention to data collection on biophysical processes of water flow, and then innovate or change their practices. Some studies also showed that new stewardship activities might be undertaken, for example, by keeping nutrient-rich water out of the river system. But in periods of low water, some farmers were less likely to participate in other types of stewardship activities, so this effect can depend on the farmer's situation and what's being asked of them. And finally, for low water, and in fact for all water categories in this study, the review found that all of the research on people's spiritual and cultural connections to waterways in the Murray-Darling Basin were on First Nations perspectives and experiences. So there were no studies on non-Indigenous spiritual and cultural connections to waterways in periods of low water. And we heard from the workshop participants that this is something that they felt was an important gap. Now, a number of studies in this category described how low flow or drought has a significant effect on the ecological health of river systems, which in turn affects all aspects of First Nations people's lives, including their health, wellbeing, culture, and knowledge. The importance of cultural flows for sustaining cultural and spiritual connections to country was also highlighted by several studies, along with lack of real decision-making power for Indigenous communities in water management throughout the Murray-Darling Basin. Drought reduces access to culturally significant food and other natural resources, which in turn affects health and well-being of individuals and the wider community. And cultural learning is also impacted, and people are less likely to use these areas in low water for social or recreational gatherings, as well as for Indigenous traditions, practices, customary obligations and ceremonies. On the positive side, the drought in one study was found to brought First Nations peoples together to establish collective action to care for country. So if we turn now to managed water effects, which can increase water access to some, but not for others. In the interest of time, I won't cover all of the findings, but I will highlight some of the key effects. So in terms of waterway use, the studies found that, as with low water, the majority of the papers that discussed water effects on communities focused on livelihood impacts. Now, these papers discuss impacts in terms of either the buyback of water entitlements through water markets or water allocation more generally. And they highlighted that these water management mechanisms create winners and losers. The positive effects were found for water investors, and while water trading can provide a form of income, those needing to buy water are, of course, negatively impacted by the high prices. Water allocations also influence farmers' decision-making, especially when they have access to water availability information. However, some communities have felt overlooked in government decision-making processes. Some studies also noted that over-allocation can have significant effects on downstream communities, so it's important to ensure sufficient flows in rivers for domestic uses as well. In terms of impacts on social settings, while managed water can impact individual and community identity in similar negative ways to low flows, the water management mechanisms that enable farmers to sell their allocation or purchase water when they need it can provide a greater sense of security, so a positive effect. So this can also mean that a community is more sustainable through positive impacts such as employment. And one study noted that environmental flows can bring communities together as they experience the event. However, in contrast to that study, environmental flows can also impede people's recreational enjoyment of waterways, and some people felt that their needs in this regard were overlooked in favour of environmental objectives. In terms of effects on stewardship and ecological learning, there were actually only 3 papers in total in this category, 2 of which were in the Northern Basin. And these papers noted the collective observation and learning outcomes that result from experiencing changes from environmental flows, and the effect of water markets on farmers who need to pay greater attention to environmental data such as rainfall and learn new ways to reduce their water use. And finally, on spiritual and cultural connections, the negative effects were similar to those of low flow effects, notably the lack of recognition of First Nations peoples in decision-making or activities such as water trading. One study highlighted traditional owners' criticism of environmental flows as being too narrowly focused on measuring criteria such as fish or breeding birds, rather than taking that more holistic view of impacts of these flows on all of life. However, there were positive effects as well from managed water when it helps to sustain the health of river systems, including providing important food sources, bringing Indigenous families back to country to camp, and share cultural knowledge. And our last category is high water or flooding effects. So the studies on these effects were really limited in number and scope. So of the 5 studies in this category, none were focused on the Northern Basin. What we learned, though, is that in terms of how flooding affects people's waterway use, the literature showed flooding can have positive impacts on livelihoods in the form of boosting agricultural production and building social relations within the community as they learn to deal with the flood impacts. There's also negative impacts such as increasing pests on farms. The effects on waterways as social settings include limiting recreational opportunities, unless you like paddling down the river in flood, I suppose, but as well as property prices, which can influence the social demographics of a particular area. Now, flooding has also been found to impact human health through the increased incidence of Ross River virus. Now, you'll notice in this category that there's 2 entries there in orange text. So these are the gaps identified by the workshop participants. They felt there was a need for more research to understand the community identity and wellbeing impacts of flooding, as well as the impacts on insurance costs for landholders. Now, flooding was also found to affect learning and stewardship among farmers who collaborate and innovate to manage crops and pests as well. The literature did not find any studies on social effects of flooding on spiritual or cultural connections. So, in a nutshell, this helped us to identify some areas where there are key gaps in the research knowledge about how the Northern Basin communities are experiencing that water variability. So the literature review suggests there's still a lot of research that could be of value here, particularly in the areas of low and water management, and specifically the effects of waterways as social settings, stewardship and ecological learning, spiritual and cultural connections, and then for all effects for flooding in the Northern Basin communities. Now, I just want to point out that this work is not saying that this knowledge does not exist. It's simply that the empirical research hasn't yet documented the impacts. So we acknowledge that communities themselves really understand these effects and experience these impacts acutely, and that some of these effects can differ greatly between the Northern and the Southern Basin. So we come away from this feeling like it is really important that we continue to strive to learn from these communities' experiences and their knowledge to help develop strategies that are going to, put mechanisms in place to support communities into the future, as we know more and more of this change is going to come to the fore. Okay, so that's it from me. I want to thank you all very much for your time. Tony Webber, especially for some of the photographs that we've used in this presentation. And I really look forward to the discussion that we're about to have with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki. That was a very interesting presentation, and I thank the audience especially for the many questions that are still flowing in the Q&A function. I've tried to keep up with some. I think Marty also has. There are still quite a few in the Q&A that we can now answer as a panel, and we also have some other questions that might be interesting as well. So I'll actually hand over to Marty, I think, to facilitate or chair this little panel session.
Thanks, Nev. I think most of these questions, Vicki, are going to be relevant for you to answer, but Nev, you might be able to jump in depending on the questions. I'll start with the ones in the chat here. So Jennifer has asked, for your literature review, did you search Trove?
No, we didn't, but don't forget the time boundary was from year 2000 onwards. It would have been a much more extensive literature review if we'd gone into Trove as well. So we did exclude newspaper articles, which of course would have some really valuable information in it, but we were looking for those empirical peer review studies.
And that pretty much answers the second question in here, which was, what was the relevant inclusion/exclusion criteria to identify relevant papers? So you've touched on some that you've excluded newspapers. Were there any other key inclusions or exclusions?
Well, I've probably had most of those on the slide that, it had to be peer-reviewed studies. So they could be the grey literature studies as well. Had the time boundary, it had to be focused on the basin. We did first do a shorter round looking just at the Northern Basin and realised very quickly that there's value in extending it to the entire basin. In fact, in the report, we've got the entire criteria explained. So perhaps I might put that answer on hold and it will be available in the report.
Next question, I'll probably touch on this one here, which was, how was management of water defined? So, for example, are these direct impacts of government decisions, or could they be perceived impacts?
Well, any of the impacts may be perceived because that's basically what is documented in the research. So, and as a social scientist, it doesn't matter so much whether it's actual or perceived, because even if it's perceived, it's still having an impact on people. So if I look back at there was quite a lot of search terms that we use to describe what variability means and what some of those drivers were. We did start off with a shorter list and then worked with the project advisory committee to create that much more extensive list. Again, that will be available in the report, but I'm happy to share that list again on the screen if that helps.
Vicki. Another question from Anna. How many community meetings did you have, and did you think the representation that you got was good?
No, it was absolutely not representative. So what happened with the workshop, so this is a fairly small scale project in terms of budget and time. So we had to run the one workshop online. The workshop participants were people who were recommended by the Project Advisory Committee, and they were people who were invited to the workshop, and we had, Marty, it was about 20 in the end. Yeah. So we weren't aiming for actual representation within the community, but this is one area I'd love to do some more work on, that is going out to the communities to really, talk through some of these gaps. But I feel like this is an area that's really ripe for a lot more work, particularly from social scientists who, can bring a different lens to the challenges that they're facing.
Yeah, I think Tim also put a comment, question/comment in here saying, I wonder if the limited Northern Basin science is due to the reduced number of researchers who live here versus the Southern Basin. We tend to research our own patches first. What's your thoughts on that take from a researcher's perspective?
I'm probably not the best person to ask, except that I feel like my gut feeling is that I wholeheartedly agree. The differences in the population and the focus, I guess, a lot of work is really obvious between the two parts of the basin. Yeah.
Neb, do you want to touch on that one as well as a Southern Basioner?
Yes, well, there's certainly many reasons why, and a lot of evidence to show that the Northern Basin is less well studied. It's a very different system as well, as far as water management is concerned, a very different history. It's quite fascinating actually how different the North and the South actually are from many different perspectives, which actually makes then whole of basin management quite challenging. I actually have also been seeing a couple of questions or watching the questions in the Q&A function. Now, we do obviously have a few people from overseas, and I also did myself have a question, which is around, the relevance of the IPBES framework to the local on-ground circumstances. And so I'm just wondering if Vicki would like to comment, because obviously the IPBES work has been happening for a long time at a global scale. I'm just really curious to know whether you think, Vicki, it would be applicable, resonate, be relevant to, communities in the Northern Basin. And you may have actually got answers to this through your workshop with the community through the end of the project. So, yeah, it'd be good if you can comment on that.
Yeah. Well, the short answer is yes, absolutely. There's always a but. What I think is useful is to try to do some more work on rewording it so that it's more understandable in plain language. So, it really allows us to understand that people can hold multiple values and perspectives on natural resources. So that's really, really helpful. It also helps us understand how people are connected to those natural resources as well. What I've found too in using it in other projects as well is it also provides a useful prompt and checklist as a social scientist to remind yourself of the other values that are not always quite so obvious. So as you saw, it really highlighted that most of our research effort to date has focused on waterways as a natural resource that people use to sustain their livelihoods, etc. But it also highlighted then the lack or the comparatively smaller amount of research on those spiritual and cultural connections, which are incredibly important for, First Nations peoples, but as a community members in the workshop said, it's really important for them too. So I find it a really useful framework in that regard. But what I'd like to see is more work to be done on explaining that framework to the wider community when we're using it in maybe some simpler language.
I'll just go back to the Q&A box. So Tesfa has said, in terms of water variability, was there any studies that investigated the magnitude of variability and trend?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that because our wonderful Natalie Jones did all of the reading and reviewing those papers, so I'd have to check with her, but I can't imagine they wouldn't have. We have a list at the end of our report going to the CRC of all of the papers that were included, so you could certainly take a look at those references once that's published.
And now the next one, I'm going to, it's a bit of a long one, but it's interesting. Susan says, I am interested that the matter of participation in decision-making was frequently observed in the different conditions. Was this a theme that emerged from the texts or a criteria in your analysis framework? Seems that the results have expanded thinking about what constitutes as participation. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it came through in the themes rather than the criteria and in the framework. So the papers were reviewed for themes first and then matched up with the framework afterwards, I believe. So again, Natalie's probably the best person to speak to that, but I'd be happy to take any further questions about that to her and get back to you. But I find that a very interesting aspect too, as a social scientist, how we think that we do public consultation well, but what we often don't think about is who's being excluded. And in the work that we're doing across all of our projects, we're really trying to help the people that we work with understand what those sometimes unintended consequences are from not thinking about participation in that really broad representative sense.
Let's pick one more from this Q&A, and then I've got a couple other questions to ask you on my list here. Question here, noting that this is a literature review and a project that was based in the Northern Murray-Darling Basin. But there's a question here about what's your perspective across the world in this sense, in the water management space. You might not have thought too much about it, but I thought I would just ask anyway.
Sorry, my perspective on what exactly?
So the literature review focused on the basins in Australia, but what is your overview across the world? Do you have much to do with other areas in the country, in water? What's your work? Where does it take you?
Yeah, I guess, well, my work as an environmental social scientist is all over the place. I typically work in a lot of marine settings as well, so marine spatial planning, for example, and community engagement in that. But what I find interesting is that we can learn a lot about what else is going on in terms of effects of, for example, flooding in Australia and how communities, look at the northern rivers, for example, but of course other parts of Australia too that are outside of the basin, and what can we take from our learning about those communities' experiences and apply to the basin. Is it different, particularly in the Northern Basin? Some of the farmers we've spoken to in the Northern Basin outside of this project have really emphasised those positive benefits of flooding, for example, whereas if we speak to people in Lismore, it's not viewed as a positive experience. So, I think there's some really, if you if you can broaden your view, there's some really interesting lessons from social scientific research, certainly across the world too. I mean, that would be a global study would be super interesting.
Thank you. I've got a question here for both of you. Vicki, you did identify some of the gaps in research in your presentation, but why do you think these gaps exist in the Northern Basin?
I think Neville spoke quite well about that just before. Yeah, I mean, there is an issue of, population size and differences, I suppose, in the basin, in the Northern Basin compared to the Southern Basin. Different systems. I'm probably not experienced enough in the history of the basin to really understand that well, but perhaps Neville can say a bit more about that.
Yeah, so interestingly also, given the lack of research in the north on flood and the impacts or relationships to social values and conditions, that's probably characteristic also of the fact that the last 20 to 30 years have been mostly about drought and low flow. And there has been, of course, flooding and some particularly bad ones in recent times, but I guess it just hasn't been a significant focus of research because of the fact that also floods are very short. They happen quickly, they dissipate quickly in general, whereas droughts can last for years, of course. They emerge slowly and they can often take a while to break as well. So that time characteristic and the fact that in the last few decades, drought has been probably more characteristic of the extremes. However, of course, a lot of the predictions under the climate change modelling suggest that both the drought and flooding characteristics will become more extreme and more frequent. So, yeah, there's clearly a gap there on understanding relationships and impacts of flood to or on social characteristics and social values in basin communities. I think also I was a bit surprised that some of the mental health and physical health aspects, also again of flooding, but perhaps even more generally, were not as well studied as I would have imagined. What about Vicki, are there other research gaps that surprised or stood out to you?
Yeah, definitely the flooding effects. And because I suppose flooding is probably closer to the top of my mind than here in Brisbane and particularly the Northern Rivers region nearby. But yeah, I guess the thing that surprised me most, and this is a reflection of, some of these unintended biases you have, was really the positive effects that farmers were telling us about flooding. So I think that's something that could perhaps be explored a bit more, and we could learn a bit more about how farmers collaborate and innovate in those times.
That's probably goes quite nicely to my final question here, noting that we're going to run out of time. What's next after this research?
What would I like to see happen next, you mean?
Sure. Yeah, let's go with that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was lucky enough to be at the CRC's event in Albury last year, and what we heard quite strongly was that real need for more work with First Nations peoples, particularly on, the outcomes of river health for those people. As rights holders, I feel like they've, it's clear in that review that their perspectives and their input into decision making have really been overlooked, is probably putting it nicely. So I'd like to see a lot more work done on that area and working out too how their participation in decision making might, not just decision making, but we identified in the literature this desire to participate in water training as well, how that might be negotiated. I think that just the holistic view that First Nations peoples bring to these issues is such a valuable lens that I'd love to see more work going in that direction, that can work out how to bring the community, or the rest of the community, on that journey to understanding the whole of the system rather than us being separate. And then, of course, more work on flooding would be, flooding effects would be really critical, particularly when we want to help work out strategies to help communities into the future. There is a lot of work going on in that space, flooding and drought resilience, but there's obviously a need for more.
Thank you, Vicki. I'll hand back to you, Nez, to wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Marty, and thanks, Vicki. So just to conclude, firstly, thank you all for attending, and also for the many questions in the Q&A function. Unfortunately, we didn't get to all of them, but I hope we certainly satiated your need for answers to some degree. As an attendee, you can also receive a certificate of attendance, which can be used to count towards CPD hours. I also want to remind everyone there's the next webinar is in about 4 weeks' time. In fact, exactly 4 weeks from today, 22nd of May, and it's all about responding to water availability in the Murray-Darling Basin, and looking at adaptation, innovation, and community development, which is a very hot topic at the moment. So please do register and join that one. So yes, thank you all for coming, and see you next time.